The Baltic Sea is important to Russia in many ways. Russia, by way of the Kaliningrad exclave, uses it to intimidate NATO with hybrid warfare tactics. The Baltic Sea is also an important transit route for Russia's Shadow Fleet ships, as well as being what is now referred to as a NATO lake in which Russia needs to maintain a presence. However, the Baltic Sea represents something else to Russia. A route to the emerging Arctic front that Vladimir Putin hopes to dominate in the coming years. The US isn't going to allow that domination to happen. US submarine hunters are now swarming Russia's border and the Baltic Sea, leaving Putin's Arctic front exposed. Newsweek broke the news on September 30 with a report that detailed how the US has deployed several military aircraft to Norway. That alone wouldn't be huge news. Norway is a NATO member, and it's not unusual for aircraft to be deployed there and elsewhere throughout the Nordic and Baltic regions. But what makes this deployment special is the type of aircraft the US has sent. These planes aren't yet more fighter jets NATO can use to deter Russia's drone and jet incursions. The US has sent an aircraft that's capable of hunting submarines and spying on enemies in and around the Baltic Sea. That aircraft is the US Navy P-8 Poseidon. And it looks like the US has sent several of them to watch Russia's borders and thwart Putin's plans for the Baltic Sea and the Arctic. The Kyiv Independent provides the basic details about this aircraft's capabilities, reporting that it's used for both anti-submarine warfare and surface vessel observation and intelligence gathering. Remember the mention of Russia's Shadow Fleet in the introduction to this video? The P-8 Poseidon is the perfect aircraft for identifying and tracking vessels in that fleet, making them less useful to Russia in the process. The US Naval Academy, or USNA, offers more information. It says that the P-8 Poseidon is a modified Boeing 737-800ERX that combines reliability with a turbofan jet to offer speed and strength in the same package. The P-8 is also modular, as it features an open mission system architecture that allows the US to adjust and expand its loadout and systems depending on the type of mission in which it takes part. Surveillance is the P-8's main function, and it's equipped with plenty of tools for that particular job. Among them are an array of sensors, including both active multi-static and passive acoustic sensor systems that it can use to detect submarines. Infrared sensors are also installed in the aircraft, as is a digital magnetic anomaly detector. In short, the P-8 has everything that it needs to wait and watch what's happening below, with this array of sensors allowing it to zone in on anything that's different from the norm. The aircraft is also handy in a fight, though such fights would typically see it taking on ships and submarines rather than fighter jets and attack types. USNA says that the P-8 has an internal 5-station weapons bay, in addition to 4-wing pylons and 2 centerline pylons that can be used to support weapons. As with the surveillance gear, these weapons vary depending on the mission. The P-8 can be loaded with mines, torpedoes, bombs and cruise missiles, all of which are supported by a digital stores management system. The UK's Royal Navy, which also operates the aircraft, offers a few more details. It notes that the P-8's twin CFM 56-7 jet engines can generate 27,000 pounds of force each, giving the aircraft a maximum speed of about 563 miles per hour. Of course, that's not impressive when stacked up against fighter jets that can break the sound barrier. But for an aircraft the size of the P-8, it's more than fast enough to allow it to navigate large areas in short amounts of time. Perfect for patrolling the Baltic Sea, for instance. The P-8 can also reach a maximum altitude of 41,000 feet, allowing it to surveil without being visible to the naked eye from a Russian ship. And if it does happen to be caught and attacked, the P-8 has several defenses. These include a missile approach warning system, and both infrared countermeasures and a dedicated countermeasure dispenser. Oh, and the aircraft can also be loaded with 129 sonar buoys that it can drop into a sea or ocean to aid in submarine detection. The P-8 is a very impressive aircraft with capabilities that make it a nightmare for Russian ships. And now, the US is sending several to Norway so they can operate in the Baltic Sea and close to the Arctic, right on Russia's border. How many is the obvious question. The OSINT Technical X account may have the answer, as it's tracked flight data that confirms US P-8s have arrived at the military terminal of Norway's Gardermoen Airport. Either 2 or 3 P-8s touched down at the base on September 23, the X account says. And worse yet for Russia, those aircraft aren't sitting idle. They're already flying in regions where Russia doesn't want this type of surveillance plane operating. US Navy P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft continue to loiter off the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad tonight, OSINT technical reports. Multiple P-8s have deployed to Oslo in recent days, just a short flying time to the newly drone-plagued Baltic region. Newsweek adds that at least one of the P-8s has patrolled the Baltic Sea, traveling right up to the coast of Kaliningrad. It isn't clear whether that flight actually involved violating Russian airspace, as several Russian drones and fighter jets have done to NATO over the last few weeks. But even if the P-8 stayed far enough away from Kaliningrad to ensure Russia can't complain of an incursion, the very presence of this plane in the Baltic Sea can only mean bad things for Putin. It shows Russia that NATO is watching. And now that NATO is watching, it's going to be waiting for Russia to make a mistake, with anything from a ship that's in its shadow fleet to the submarines that may be patrolling the Baltic waters unseen. Worse still for Russia, the fact that these aircraft come from the US shows Putin that whatever hold he might have thought he had over US President Donald Trump doesn't exist anymore. In truth, it hasn't for a while. The arrival of P-8s to the Baltic is just one of several measures the US has taken over the last couple of months to strengthen NATO's defensive posture against Russia in the region. For instance, August 1st saw Trump get so frustrated with Putin and his cronies that he announced the deployment of a pair of nuclear submarines to the Baltic waters. That move came in response to remarks by Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Medvedev, who railed against Trump's threat to impose tariffs against any country that buys oil from Russia. Each new ultimatum is a threat and step towards war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. Don't go down the Sleepy Joe road, Medvedev posted to X on July 28. Whether it was the threat or the Sleepy Joe wisecrack that pushed Trump into action, the US president was quick to respond. Trump took to his Truth Social platform a couple of days later to announce that nuclear submarines would be the response to Medvedev's words. Based on the highly provocative statements of the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, I've ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions, just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that, Trump declared. All of this may seem like a tit-for-tat game between the US and Russia. However, that doesn't change the outcome. The appropriate regions Trump mentioned will likely have been either the Baltic or Arctic, which is ideal for NATO. Its collective defensive posture was increased by the deployment of these subs that, for all anyone knows, might still be prowling beneath the waves of the Baltic Sea. About a month later, the US also sent a carrier group toward the Arctic to take part in a joint military training exercise with Norwegian forces. This deployment saw the US carrier group enter the Barents Sea, which Newsweek points out is part of the Arctic Ocean and, more importantly, lies off the coasts of both Norway and Russia. The deployment included the USS Mahan and the USS Bainbridge, which are both Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that have been assigned to the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier in the past. This deployment was temporary. The ships left the Barents Sea following the training exercise. Still, they served as yet another signal from the US that it's both increasingly willing to cooperate with its NATO allies and that it isn't afraid to project power in Putin's direction. Now, with P-8s arriving in Norway, that message has been carved into stone. The US isn't going to allow Russia to do whatever it wants in a sea that's often referred to as a NATO lake. And now, NATO is going to be able to watch everything that Russia does in the Baltic Sea and by extension the Arctic, both above and below the waves. The submarine hunters are on Russia's border, and they're active. This means several things for Putin and both his Baltic and Arctic ambitions, starting with the obvious. 2 or 3 P-8s in Norway is massive for NATO's air policing mission in the Baltic Sea. Separate from this latest deployment, the US has been taking part in that mission for quite some time. Back in July, Newsweek reports another P-8 deployed to Iceland's Keflavik Air Base, from where it participated in a NATO mission dubbed Baltic Sentry. The odds are high that this latest deployment of P-8s is going to be doing something similar in terms of helping NATO forces to counteract Russia's attempts to destabilize the Baltic region with its hybrid warfare tactics. That's the entire point of NATO's air policing, which the organization describes as a peacetime mission that aims to preserve the security of Allied skies. It's a collective task and involves the continuous presence, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, of fighter aircraft and crews, which are ready to react quickly to possible airspace violations. P-8s aren't going to serve as part of the response teams for these sorts of incidents. They're not built to take on fighter jets. However, they will add to what amounts to an early warning system for NATO's aerial police, in addition to being capable of keeping track of Russian ships and submarines that NATO naval forces may have to take on. This sort of strengthened presence in the Baltic and across NATO's eastern flank is vital. Russia has been getting up to a lot of shady things throughout September. Drone and fighter jet incursions into NATO airspace appear to have become a common tactic for Russia during the last month or so. Euronews reports that at least 10 European countries have experienced these kinds of incursions over the last couple of months, with many having taken place during September. Russia sending 19 drones into Poland grabbed all of the headlines, but Russia has pulled similar tricks against Romania, Germany, Denmark, and France in recent weeks. P-8s aren't made to fight against drones. They're not even built to spot them, though they could probably serve that purpose if needed. These two statements may make one wonder what Russia's drone incursions have to do with the P-8s arriving in Norway. It all comes down to Russia's shadow fleet. Recently, Ukraine revealed that this fleet, which most thought Russia used solely to skirt Western oil sanctions, has taken on a much more nefarious purpose. These ships are being used to launch the very drones that are now entering European airspace. Find out more about Ukraine's claims in our in-depth video covering this major issue. As for P-8s, they may not do much about drones, but they can locate shadow fleet ships. That alone makes them a valuable tool against Russia's new drone strategy, as P-8s may be capable of proving not only that shadow fleet ships are sailing through the Baltic, but also that Russia is using these ships for its drone attacks. Then there are the submarines. Tracking Russia's undersea vessels in the Baltic may be the primary reason why the US has sent P-8s to Norway. However, there are questions around just how many submarines these aircraft will be looking for. At one point in time, Russia's Baltic fleet had a massive number of submarines. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained around 130 submarines that all operated as part of the Baltic fleet. Those days are long gone, the Carnegie Endowment points out. Now, Russia operates just a single diesel-electric attack submarine as part of its Baltic fleet, which begs the question of why up to 3 P-8s have gone to Norway. For one, it's perhaps more accurate to say that Russia operates one known submarine in the Baltic Sea. There may be others. Tackling the shadow fleet is another reason why these planes have been deployed to Norway, as is strengthening NATO's defensive posture, as was just covered. However, another reason that P-8s have arrived in Norway is that NATO isn't just concerned about what Russia is doing in the Baltic Sea. Another potential front is on its agenda, and it's one that Russia has placed a lot of focus on over the last few years: the Arctic. Norway is very much a part of the Arctic, at least some of it is. The Arctic Circle runs directly through Nordland County, which is in the north of Norway. This gives Norway a direct interest in what happens in the Arctic, and due to Norway being a NATO nation, it also gives NATO a direct interest. Furthermore, the Baltic Sea is connected to the Arctic via the White Sea-Baltic Canal. That canal was built by Russia and has been operating since 1933, which essentially means that Russia has built its own connection between two regions in which it has interests of its own. It's tempting to see what happens in the Baltic as being focused solely on Eastern and Northern Europe. The reality is that anything that America P-8s find in the Baltic could also end up in the Arctic, and vice versa. It's also in the Arctic where a P-8 submarine hunting capabilities are going to come in very handy. According to the Network for Strategic Analysis, the Russian Northern Fleet is the primary naval force operating in the Arctic. Submarines are a huge part of that fleet, to the point where the fleet has more subs than it does surface ships. There are around 25 submarines to 20 surface ships in the Russian Northern Fleet, and that creates an obvious problem for NATO. Of course, NATO wants to know what these submarines are getting up to in Arctic waters. However, the existence of the canal mentioned earlier means that it's also possible that Russia is sending submarines from the Arctic to the Baltic Sea undetected. If that's happening, NATO wants to know about it. The new P-8s in Norway will ensure that it does. Returning to the Arctic specifically, Russia has made no secret of its desire to exploit that region. Climate change and the melting of Arctic ice are slowly unveiling new shipping routes through the Arctic, in addition to possibly providing access to natural resources that Russia would love to control. The Atlantic Council explained more in an April article, where it said that gaining control over the Arctic's northern sea route is so critical to the Kremlin's plans that Putin has prioritized building a militarized presence in the region. Moscow sees the northern sea route as part of Russia's national transport infrastructure and has sought to control access for shipping from other nations, the council adds, which sheds light on what Russia really wants to do: take control over Arctic shipping. With the northern sea route being so vast, Russia can't legitimately claim that the entire route is part of its territorial waters, so it's militarizing. It's trying to use its submarines to intimidate any other nation that might mount a challenge to Russia's Arctic ambitions. The US, which has its own Arctic interests alongside Canada and Norway, may be using its P-8s to make the challenge that Putin had hoped would never come. If nothing else, NATO will get a better idea what Russia's submarines actually do in the Arctic region. That, coupled with the Baltic mission, may be enough. Having said that, something mentioned much earlier in the video remains relevant. OSINT Technical tracked the first P-8 sortie to the outskirts of the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Sandwiched between Poland and the Baltic states, Kaliningrad is yet another Russian threat that NATO wants to keep an eye on. Kaliningrad certainly has strategic importance due to this positioning alone. It offers Russia more access to the Baltic Sea for one, which ties back into the points made earlier about the benefits of a P-8 presence in the Baltic. Beyond that, this small territory, which the US Naval Institute says measures just 5,800 square miles, is believed to be home to several of Russia's tactical Iskander missiles. Those missiles have a range of 310 miles and are capable of carrying nuclear warheads. So any surveillance offering information about what is and isn't happening with those missiles will be helpful to NATO. The P-8s now in Norway may be able to provide such intelligence. At the very least, the US planes will be able to track vessels sailing in and out of Kaliningrad, which in turn might provide information on what precisely Russia is sending to its exclave. The US has concerns about Kaliningrad, just as it does about the Arctic and the Baltic Sea. Those concerns manifested as a veiled threat in July when the commander of US Army Europe and Africa, General Chris Donahue, let Russia know what he believes NATO forces could take Kaliningrad in a time frame that's unheard of. Russia's exclave is one of the most militarized regions in Europe, the Kyiv Independent says. It's also the origin of a host of electronic warfare tactics, most of which revolve around GPS spoofing and jamming, that have affected ships and aircraft in the Baltic region ever since Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. P-8s keeping eyes on Kaliningrad can be classed as an extension of what's likely their main mission in the Baltic Sea. The exclave is clearly a priority. If it wasn't, the first P-8 deployment since the aircraft arrived in Norway wouldn't have ended up so close to Kaliningrad's borders. Ultimately, the US P-8s have just strengthened NATO's presence in several key regions, and only time will tell what those aircraft end up doing. Now, on the Kaliningrad front, NATO has plenty of reasons to be concerned about the Russian exclave. It was only a few days ago that Kaliningrad attempted to cripple the Spanish defense minister's jet in the latest in a series of hybrid warfare attacks against European ships and aircraft. Find out more about that attack and what happened after in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest US deployments around the world.